Matamai, good day and welcome everybody. My name is Craig Bleakley and I'm the Safety Risk Consultant here at EcoPortal. We firmly believe that we all win when we share and collaborate on what works for keeping people safe. So we regularly host these safety leaders and experts in an effort to share knowledge across the HSEQ and business communities. In today's session, we're so pleased to welcome global health and safety leader, Dr. Megan Tranter, to share her experiences in transforming safety culture across her illustrious career. Before we jump in, a little bit about EcoPortal, our partners, and some short housekeeping. For those who are less familiar with us, EcoPortal is the premium integrated solution for health, safety, quality, and environmental risk management. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Megan Tranter is a recognized global voice in health, safety, and environment leadership. Originally from Australia, Megan has had an impressive career spanning government, mining, and academia. She's held corporate roles at McDonald's Australia and Coca-Cola Amatil, and is among the few women who have held top EHS roles, VP and senior VP roles at Amazon, PepsiCo, Novartis, and Netflix. Now based in the US, Megan has extensive experience in global strategy development and implementation, risk management, cultural change, and board and CEO level engagement and coaching. Her mission is to spark a safety culture revolution. She now offers leadership development and consulting services to help companies and safety leaders elevate their impact and create workplaces where safety is second nature. It should be no surprise then that she was awarded the NSC Marion Martin Award for the most influential woman in safety. What a quite impressive background, one of the most impressive bios I've read out there, Megan. We're so lucky to have you join us here today, and no doubt our audience will gain tremendous value from our session. So Megan, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Craig.
And the question is, what aspect of leadership in health and safety do you find the most challenging? Is it influencing organizational culture, engaging and empowering teams, measuring impact beyond traditional metrics, and navigating global EHS challenges? There's a bit of a sneak peek, though, maybe 4 questions that we'll be asking Megan today. But out of those 4, hey, there may be other aspects, but out of those 4, which ones, for everyone that's on the call now, is the aspect that you find the most challenging? So I'll give you just a few seconds. So where in the world are you now, Megan?
I am in beautiful, rainy, cloudy Seattle.
Beautiful, rainy, cloudy Seattle.
Yeah.
Excellent. And what time in the world are we joining you today?
It's 6 o'clock at night, and I'm a day behind all of you in New Zealand and Australia.
Excellent. So we're in the future. Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice day today and the next day in the future. Brilliant. We should hopefully be getting these poll results through very shortly. Joseph, I'm happy to press go on that now if you're able to do so. Here we go. They'll be popping up any second and we'll see how these go. There we go. Influencing organizational culture. Well, streaks ahead, well over 50%. Would you say that's a pretty fair summation of your experience in the wider in the wider industry there, Megan?
Yeah, the role of the health and safety professional, I think, has certainly changed over the years. And one of the expectations these days is that we really do have a role to play in influencing others, but it's not an easy thing to do. And I think often it's not something that we're trained to do. It takes a little bit of practice and experience as well.
Megan, let's start off with a global perspective, some really big picture thinking. What are some of the key challenges EHS leaders face when operating in different cultural contexts? And how can these challenges be effectively addressed?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I've had the good fortune of working in some pretty well-known brands and companies, and you mentioned those earlier, and in global roles as well. And I think possibly one of the biggest challenge in a global role is understanding what is culturally appropriate in one country or even one business unit versus another. So you might find that you work for a company that may be based out of a certain place. So I've worked a lot in American-based companies and yet had global roles. And so there's been this level of discussion, if you like, about what are the right company standards that we would want to have for environment, health, and safety. And yet, how does that also apply across different countries and cultures when they may have different standards or expectations themselves? and I'm talking beyond legislative requirements,
Mm, mm,
it's
mm.
it's things that may or may not be easy to do, or a certain standard or expectation that a company may like to set may not be the norm or even possible to do in another country.
I know there've been a number of people on the call that will be part of an organization that will be have global outreach, or be part of many different countries. And to be fair, Australia and New Zealand is maybe leading in to a degree in cultural expectations or aspirations compared to maybe some other countries in the world. How did you find that balance of, if my home country, my company that I work for, is domiciled in a country with really great cultural intelligence and good engagement, dealing with maybe a manufacturing area or a sales or a distribution uh, office or department in another part of the world that has maybe quite significantly lower expectations of what good safety looks like? How did you manage that balance and that dichotomy of expectations?
I think the most important thing is to start off with the overall vision. So, as a company and also as a function of EHS, that's just what I'll call it for the ease of the audience here.
Sure.
Yeah, once we understand and discuss with others what the vision of EHS is, and every company has a different vision. Every company has different standards, different aspirations as well of what they'd like to do. But once you agree upon that as a company, there are these movements that you can have across the different business units to be able to encourage them to adopt those different standards. And I think the biggest thing that I learned over the years was patience, because every part of a business has different drivers, leaders and employees, and ultimately your colleagues. They are working on what their priorities are in a point in time, and it may not necessarily be the same as yours.
Mm,
So,
mm,
one of the pieces I think is around having patience and understanding that just because as a global leader you have certain goals and aspirations that you'd like to drive the company towards in the long term, doesn't mean that that always lines up with the constraints or context that the other business units have. And that's probably the second point, which is around context. I do think it's super important to deeply understand the organization that you're working in, and not only trying to say, well, these are my standards or this is my country's standards where I'm
mm.
coming from, and actually understand that business context, because the people on the ground, they're the ones who are living those lives every day. They know what's possible every day. And if you come in, I remember someone said to me once, Megan, you come on all these visits, because I would be traveling around the world and, flying around and visiting everyone and so forth. And someone said to me, you come here and we're all very nice to you, but, we kiss you on the cheek and say goodbye when you leave. And ultimately, you've gone then. And it really resonated with me, which was to say, as a global leader, I may have the vision. I may be trying to bring others along with me, but ultimately the execution happens at the local business unit level or local country level, and they have their context and their constraints in which they're operating.
Great insights. Nice segues nicely into this next question, and it definitely relates to that poll answer. My next question is talking about organizational culture and the influence of that. So my question to you is, how can an EHS leader, and appreciate across all the organizations that are represented today, an EHS leader may be a senior leader directly reporting to the CEO, and also maybe 3 or 4 hierarchies down the layers. How can an EHS leader effectively influence that organizational culture to prioritize health and safety? So how can those EHS leaders really get into the mindset and drive that engagement to influence organizational culture to make them prioritize health and safety?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I think you raised a good point, which is an acknowledgement that there are so many different EHS jobs and so many roles that each of us play. And some of us do play roles where we're perhaps a strategist. So we're setting a strategy either for the company or for a business unit or for even a smaller area within the company. And that takes a certain skill set, in order to be able to influence effectively. And then there are other roles where we may be on the shop floor And the skills that we need there are really, really very different to the ones that you need when you're in the board, talking to the board or talking to the CEO about various things. But one framework that I really like lately, and there are so many different frameworks on all these different things, but one of the things I love lately is a framework, and it talks about warmth and competence. So if you break those two aspects apart and start with competence first, to me, what that means is that you really know what health and safety and environment and risk and quality is all about. You're competent in the work you do. You're technically strong in the work that you do. You're not having to make it up on the fly, and you feel really good about that as well, that you have that competence to do the work. So it's the technical elements of the profession, and then also competence in understanding the organizational context, so understanding how the business operates. Because that's where I've also seen over the years where different successful EHS people may have different experiences and skills that they bring to the table. They're not always the same, but certainly understanding business context and knowing how to navigate in the organization is really important. But the second part around warmth is basically, who are you as a person, and do the people like you? And you don't have to be friends with everyone, but even if we reflect upon it ourselves, if someone is trying to influence us or convince us to do something, even if they're a rock star at the topic, if they're not warm, if they're a bit of a jerk, none of us, I think, in reality, want to be following a leader like that. So, understanding both of those two elements and then adjusting our style for different people and different business contexts, understanding what is driving different leaders or colleagues at a point in time so that we can think through, okay, with what I'm asking to be done today, or the strategy that I have, or what I'm recommending, how does that fit with the broader context of what these leaders and colleagues are trying to do themselves? So yeah, I like that framework lately. I just feel like it's easy to understand, and
Yeah.
also it resonates really personally, because also you can work with someone who's lovely, but they don't know what the topic is about. So, that's also hard for them to influence, even if they're lovely.
Yeah. It's a nice little, you've half answered my follow-up question where we talk about best practice here, which is great, and some examples you've used. I'll be interested to know as well, have you seen it gone wrong where an EHS leader is trying to influence organizational culture to prioritize health and safety, but has gone about it in a completely the wrong way? You've talked about obviously competence and warmth, and obviously we know what the opposite of that is. Is there anything else, that any other pitfalls or any other fish or red flags that if you saw an EHS that are trying to do, but within your experience that just doesn't work?
Yeah, I think being able to speak human, as my friend Jen Jackson, who's written a book on this, says. So being able to take the complexity of the topic and put it in such a way that the audience understands it. And so, for example, when I think about my time in, these big companies, and when you're speaking to the board, and that's a pretty big deal when you're needing to speak to the board of
Yeah.
a Fortune 50 company, and you've only got a certain number of minutes. It's important to understand what is important to the board and what information do they need, and how do you succinctly and concisely share it so that they understand, so that they can govern as well. And yet, on the other hand, a EHS professional might be walking around with another leader. Maybe they're doing an inspection or an audit. Maybe they're giving some on-the-ground coaching, or even just observing what's going on. And from that perspective, it's a very different style that a person would use. So I'd say, first of all, be able to take the complexity of environment, health, and safety, because I do think it's one of the most complex environments, complex functions. It's grounded in legislation, but many different parts of work are grounded in legislation as well. So I don't always lead with that. We don't always have to lead with compliance. We can lead with different levers in which to pull to have people understand what we're talking about, and then also what we're either asking for or educating others on. So, there's a little bit of reading the room that comes with that as well. Understanding different personalities, understanding what's happening on a given day, and realizing that it's not just about our agenda or my agenda. It's about what is important to someone else at a point in time.
Brilliant. Great thoughts. Thank you. When it comes to measuring impact, I'm really keen to hear your take on this. What qualitative measures or qualitative metrics have you found that EHS leaders can use to really understand their impact on workplace safety beyond just the standard, normal, usual numbers? What other metrics either you use or you saw being used with great success?
Yeah, another good question. I do think everything has changed, in terms of us now having better access to data, and certain lagging indicators are nearly table stakes, or some organizations don't even want to use them anymore just because of the lag between, a change that can happen in an organization and the ultimate impact that can happen. So I think that perhaps is what you're alluding to as well, with some of
For
those
sure.
traditional quantitative measures. One of the things that I've seen work really well is focusing on doing more of what works. So it's about celebrating the wins and celebrating the actions and activities that actually drive a strong safety culture. But it's a little hard to measure. And the reason I say that is, sure, you can go around and have your clipboard and pen or your phone or your tablet or whatever and make observations of that. But once you start having to get to that point of measuring those sort of observations, it loses a little bit, in my opinion, of the authenticity of it. And, what we're ultimately looking for in health and safety is long-term change, and that people think differently about environment, health, and safety, so that it just becomes part of the normal discussions and the normal narrative. So one of the things that I get a little bit afraid of is when you do try and measure everything, whether, number one, you're measuring the right thing, but also if it just then becomes so formal and then people start chasing numbers just for the sake of it. So yeah, definitely looking for folks' engagement, looking for leaders in particular, to lead by example. And I'm sure all of your audience here will agree that, the biggest person that has an impact on safety in a workplace is the worker's immediate supervisor, because they're setting the culture, they're setting expectations of what is normal or acceptable here, and also what isn't. They're making it a psychologically safe place or not, for people to bring forth ideas as well as concerns that they have for safety. So I think all of that sort of melds in together in this very complex answer that I'm probably giving. But suffice it to say that, the qualitative part of it is often something that is felt by people, and you do see in some organizations now they'll have evaluations, or assessments of HR in particular, but also that can be translated into how people feel about whether it's a safe place to work as well.
It's a really interesting point, and I think you've picked up on the sort of underlying theme of the question, which is the move away from the traditional LTI Triffid type stats, which used to be the only real deciding factor or thing that the boards wanted. We are seeing, quite interestingly, a move for a lot of larger enterprise clients wanting, this is from the eco-portal side of things, they're wanting a lot more functionality for things like safety observations, safety walks, leader walks, site walks. And I think they're really wanting to drive the more lead indicators. And from my perspective as a consultant, I believe there's so much more insight you can gather from that type of those metrics, right? Because it's one that's proactive, it's happening right then and there, and you can put so many more attributable KPIs or against those, as opposed to just things that might have happened 3-6 months ago, and you're determining and basing all your decisions based on that that old information. No, excellent.
Just adding
Um,
on that, though, if I may, Craig, I think
Please.
the piece, though, around things like safety walks and observations, one thing that we have to be careful as EHS professionals is that we're not just counting the numbers.
Mm,
What we actually, when we think back behind the intent of why they're introduced, there's so many different reasons. Some of them are to show visible felt leadership. So you actually see leaders out there. And so by spending their time and their energy doing it, it's perceived that that means that they care more about safety. It gives them the opportunity to speak to colleagues, employees, and understand what's actually going on, because it's the people
mm,
who are doing the work that can best share what's going on about the hazards. The other important piece that I think is often not necessarily misunderstood, but we need to focus on it more, which is when we do those sort of walkarounds and have those sort of discussions, how are we addressing the hazards that are there? Because ultimately, if we address the hazard, then that's what we're trying to do, as well as build the culture. So, this
absolutely.
piece around how quickly can we address a hazard or mitigate the risk?
Yep.
Um, what type of approach do we take? Do we work further down the hierarchy of control, or do we actually try and work further up the hierarchy of control and actually eliminate or substitute or engineer it out? So all really good points, yet they're all
Mhm.
incredibly nuanced. And
Yep.
it's why it's important that we don't just count numbers, but that we count impact and result as well.
Absolutely. I presented to at the safety show in Sydney last week on a topic, the spotlight stage around engagement. And one of the big parts of that was that visible felt leadership that you talked about. And that's all, again, well and good, right? To be visible, to be in present, and to complete a safety observation checklist. Or, yes, I've done my fourth safety walk for the week or for the month. Yay, all well and good. But you have to have that final stage of the process, which is determining corrective actions, being visible and obvious, and actually fixing the problems that have been identified in that process. Otherwise, it purely becomes just another metric that just gets against the KPI, but has no value to it. And that was one of the big points in my presentation was you have to have those completing the circle. I've been to site, I've talked to the team, I've had the chat to the guy on the machine, fixed the problem, or at least listened to it, created a corrective action, put the process in place, it was fixed. Because the next time I do that safety walk as a leader walk or whatever, someone else is going to come talk to me because they know they'll get results if I can do that. And it becomes less just face value to actual real value, right? Super important. Cool. Um, I'd love to hear a bit more about your career journey, Megan. You obviously has had quite an amazing journey getting to where you are now. Can you share a pivotal moment that really shaped your approach to the EHS leadership journey that you've ended up with?
Yeah. So with my career, I spent the first 10 years or so of my career in Australia. And I started as an occupational hygienist. I worked in the government. The Queensland used to be called the Division of Workplace Health and Safety. So as an inspector, I worked in the mining industry, and then I was in academia for 4 years before deciding I needed a real job in inverted commas, and moved over into industry. That was where I worked for McDonald's Australia and Coca-Cola and so forth.
Mm.
And then a family reason, a family opportunity brought me to the US. And I always find it funny, when people say, "Where are you from?" I say, "I'm from Seattle." And they're like, "You don't sound like you're from Seattle." And it's, because I never lost the accent despite being here for 20 years.
Oh wow, yeah,
Yeah, I've been here for more than 20 years now, actually.
yeah. That
Um,
Australian accent definitely is. It's not strong, but it's definitely still there. Yeah,
It's still there. There's
yeah.
no American accent. Let's just say that. I don't think so anyway, despite my children's wonderful American accents, because they're all born here, but
Of
I don't
course.
have one. Yeah. And so, in coming to the US, I basically had to restart my career because I moved to the US when I was 36 weeks pregnant with our first child. And then, when you come to another country without a job,
Mm.
and if you want to work again, you have to work out how to work your way forward. And I was extremely fortunate, and I do consider it good fortune to be hired by a really large company. And first of all, I was hired to look after the international operations. I lived in Chicago, but I didn't look after anything in the US or Canada. It was all international. And then over time, I moved into expanded role and kept getting promoted, and all was very good. But, you know, to get back to your question, I think one of the things that I learned, and especially for me, why safety became so important, um, I remember when I worked for a company and there was a very serious injury that occurred at that company. And before that, I had always just, you know, gone through the motions with this as a career. So I was very proud of my technical skills. I was very proud of the knowledge that I had and being able to do all the things that EHS professionals do. But I don't know that I really understood the true impact of a role like the colleagues here have until that incident happened. And then I realized that, you know, this is an incredibly noble profession, and one that we are constantly striving to do better with, without even often knowing, you know, the faces or the names of people that we're trying to protect. So for me, the pivotal moment came, and it was in my early 30s, actually. So to think that I went probably 10 years into my career without having that special feeling of impact that this role has, both on work colleagues, but also on the world. And I think it's also why I really enjoy working for big companies, because there's a compounding effect and a multiplying effect. You know, when you work, and I'm not saying that one job is better than the other, so I don't want to get misquoted there at all. But one of the things that I've found and has given me an incredible amount of job satisfaction is this understanding that as I have progressed along in my career and my scope has expanded and the scale of the companies that I've worked for has expanded. You know, I've worked for companies with more than 1 million employees as their number one EHS person. When you understand that you have that privilege and responsibility, what you also understand is that if you can make certain changes both within the company, it can also impact a town, a state, a country, and eventually the world. And maybe that sounds too altruistic, but I've seen it happen in such a way. It takes time. You know, they often say to parents, don't they, that the days are long and the years are short. And I feel the same way with my career, that, you know, as you're working every day and trying to have people understand what this crazy profession of safety in particular is all about. And sometimes people don't want to listen. And, you know, maybe those who are listening to us here, this resonates for them as well. I've certainly had that experience where, you know, you've been told to go away, let's just say, in a nice way. And then you have other experiences where people are extremely engaged and they want to know more and they want to know what they can do as well. But the piece that I find really quite beautiful about the profession of health and safety in particular is just the way that we as professionals can make a difference in so many people's lives without maybe even necessarily understanding it. And I remember a particular example, you know, one of the companies I worked for had a very large fleet. Actually, it was the largest privately owned fleet in the world. And so, you know, that company had everything from bikes to motorbikes to boats to cars, vans, trucks, you know, you name it, they had it. And at the time when I worked for them, you know, there wasn't necessarily a full understanding at the beginning about the risk associated with driving on the road. And, you know, the world has changed, and I'm very happy to see now that, you know, a lot of things have progressed. But even by raising that topic and starting to get involved in industry organizations, and one of them then became an NGO, a non-governmental organization, and all of these groups are aiming to make a big difference in the world. It just, you know, brings home this importance of purpose-driven roles like we have, and for each of us to hopefully remember each day, and especially on the days that are really tough, that this is what we're here for, and that we are making a difference even when, we think we may not be.
Mm.
So I think, one of the things I'm trying to do also now is really encourage EHS and risk professionals to take that deep breath in and, think about the impact that they're having. And even though we get told that our roles are compliance roles, and we know that we're here managing risk, I'd love if we started thinking more about how noble and purposeful our roles are so that we can get our own job satisfaction about the work that we do.
Megan, that's incredibly inspiring. Wow, that's a very eloquent way of taking that. I know as a health and safety professional, some of those days can really be just hitting your head against the wall, going, "I'm not getting any. No one's engaging. What am I doing this for?" But you take that step back, and that's quite incredible. I think your stat of, the highest top of the pyramid of 1 million workers, that's quite an incredible stat and a role to have. So, thank you for those inspirational words. Hey, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about strategic alignment. Sometimes again, quite a struggle with EHS professionals. How do you think EHS initiatives can be aligned with broader business goals to boost engagement throughout the organization? And I'll often getting through to the board and upper management, um, trying to get EHS goals. If there's not a commercial benefit to the business, sometimes you get blocked, without even having the chance of explaining the why. In your experience, how do you think you can better align those EHS initiatives with those broader business goals?
I don't know if I have a single magic solution, because one of the things that I found during my career as well is sometimes the door was really easy to push open, and other times that door was just so locked closed that you had to look for a different door to go through. And, I remember an amazing boss of mine once, he actually used that analogy of the doors. And he said, "Megan, you can be pushing really hard on that door, but if it's not going to open, then you're going to be pushing and putting all that effort and force into it, and nothing is going to happen. The door is not going to open. So you can be patient, and, organizations change, people change over time, and that eventually that door might open, or you can look for a different door to push on, and maybe that door will open. So sometimes what this might look like is, for example, working with a smaller part of a business to get alignment and engagement on goals. So, or vice versa, coming top down and actually working that way to get the goals through the company. But I think the most important thing, and this is what I don't think we were trained to do as EHS professionals, but it's something that I've learned, is truly understanding business context. And that is, to me, that is the most important role, an important thing that an EHS professional can have. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is understanding that, yes, we certainly have goals as EHS professionals. Many of us who are certified, with our certifications have an ethics clause, in our certifications as well. I know as a CIH, there is a section on ethics, and, I take that very, very seriously. Yet, if you don't have the backing of your colleagues and other leaders behind you, and part of that means, understanding what they're going through, understanding what the business is going through, and that becomes business context, then you're just really talking into a tunnel. No, you're right. No one is listening. They're telling you to kindly go away, or, you get put on the agenda last. And then, of course, the meeting goes long and you've done all this preparation. You're sitting there and you're like, what about me? Or I think a bigger mistake is for us to think that safety is always number one in the minds of business leaders. And, without being too controversial, I don't know that that is always the case. But what I do know is that when you understand business context, you then start having different levers to pull. So, for example, you might have what I call a stacked win. So what a stacked win is when there may be a hazard that needs to be controlled, or the risk needs to be mitigated. But going alone as a safety professional and trying to convince people to do that will kindly get you exited out the door or, like I said, put last on the agenda. But if, for instance, you could link it with productivity improvements, if you could link it with building competence and training, perhaps it's linked to some type of union arrangement or, some sort of agreement. When you start stacking the safety wins alongside other levers in the business that are important, first of all, you're not standing alone. As a safety person, it often feels like we're standing alone. We need to do this, we need to do that, and just yelling into the nothing. But actually, if you're standing beside your colleagues and the head of engineering or equipment, is looking for some new equipment, and then someone else is saying, yeah, we need more productivity and we need to cut costs here and here, then when you pull those stacked wins together, then that's where you can actually get a lot more happening. And, it links to your question about strategy. You link together what the ultimate impact and outcomes of having a safe workplace are with other elements of business context that are important at the same time or that the business believes are important.
That's nice. And let's explore the topic of diversity and inclusion just for a moment. As a, to say, trailblazer for women in health and safety, how can bringing in diverse perspectives really strengthen EHS strategies?
Another great question. I think of DEI as being extremely broad and, having worked across many countries and many companies and different business units, I've seen the value that you get and the extra thoughts and ways of thinking about things and solutions when you have a diverse team. I think there's this other piece though, and I'll say this as a mother, I have kids. I actually have 3 kids. I worked through my whole career, and there are good things out of that, and there are other things out of that now that my children are reaching adulthood, they very kindly tell me the negatives or the other part that came out of that as well. And I think one of the things that perhaps I wish that I thought more about as a leader, and this is something that I do now, is really to understand that the more that we can embrace different types of people and the different either stage of life they're in, their different experiences, even the different ways that they communicate and they think. When you bring that in, you get a much more balanced view of life and also of the general probably population and people that you're working with to make better decisions. So from my perspective, it's all win-win, but sometimes it does feel a little difficult, because what it also means is that we have to open ourselves up to other people's opinions. And sometimes we may not like their opinions. But that's an important leadership skill to have, to be able to be open enough to appreciate that others have a point of view. And it doesn't mean that my opinion is right and theirs is wrong, but actually that they can both be right, or we can have a good debate and discussion about different ways of doing things or thinking about things.
Yeah, nice. Looking ahead to future trends, all years in the industry, you would have seen across multiple industries, across multiple countries and global spaces. What trends do you foresee impacting the future of EHS leadership? And then how can the leaders on the calls today prepare for those changes?
Yeah, I think that one of the superpowers of EHS people in the past has been a lot of the knowledge that we have. So, we understand what the hazards are. We understand how to do risk assessments. We collaborate with others to mitigate risk. But as knowledge becomes commodified and much more broadly available at an accelerated speed, then I think we need to start questioning whether our value becomes in the knowledge of the topic or if it's more in being able to make an impact and also, quite frankly, collaborating with people and helping things, making things happen. When you think about the past and the journey that lots of us have been on as EHS professionals, I think that part of what we were doing over time has been increasing the profile of health and safety. So appealing to people's hearts and minds, having them understand, that this topic is not just something that's going to go away, that it's something that's important and it has business value as well as value to individuals, their families, and the world. But one thing I wonder about is, at a point in time, are we going to move past that where people can read or research about it themselves? Do you really need that expertise of how to write a safe operating procedure and how to do a risk assessment anymore when there are other tools available? So the commodification, maybe if that's a word, of knowledge, I think, is a really important piece. But on the flip side, I think the most successful EHS professionals are the ones who will be able to understand and embrace that and not be scared of that and not see that as that is their brand, that they know, all about safety and the legislation and other things, but that they actually can become a valued colleague and member of a team to move things forward, and also to be able to explain what is the impact of the work and why is health and safety so important. So, and you see this now, I think there are still many aspects of the work that we do that still feel super manual,
Oh, yeah.
But if each of us were to even explore some of the technology that has been coming out for the last few years, it's mind-blowing, and it will help us do so much more and have so many more insights that we just never had before,
Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that we were recommending was based on perhaps our experience or our gut feel or what we'd seen someone else do. But with more data and better algorithms, we can get better insight into what's actually happening and put forth better recommendations to mitigate risk.
One of the, I think the best highlights of my role, which is taking organizations that will be on often even a manual-based process or manual-based health and safety system, or an old clunky software provider, move them to an industry-leading one like EcoPortal, and taking them through, just as a demo, through the reporting module, which at a click of a button creates a beautiful monthly board report with all the relevant graphs and insights and analytics data. And you see lighting up in their face, I now have 3 days more a month that I can actually go out and provide value to my team members, and not stuck behind a desk trying to create a board report, pulling information and just using their real top level stuff. They can now go out and get that information, drive their own analytics, understand the whole work is done versus work is imagined, getting that through. So I really resonate with your points that you made, and the abilities to use the innovation not in a negative way. I mean, we know AI is just pushing through every aspect of health and safety when it comes to both the creating of reporting, creating of observations, creating of reporting long term. But I think it actually is freeing. It's releasing to a health and safety professional who can use it as a really robust, powerful tool, as opposed to a replacement for their job. They're always going to be their jobs there, right? And now they've got amazing new tools in their toolkit. Embrace them, encourage the use of them.
Well, also, one of the criticisms of the EHS profession is that it's become too bureaucratic.
Yeah.
So the question then becomes is, if you can take bureaucracy out of it, what is the value that you're going to replace bureaucracy with? And I think that needs to be something that each of us search in our hearts and minds about ourselves as a profession, and actually start taking the profession even forward, even more, to think through, what is it if I could take away, even throw out a number, if I could take away 20 hours a week of this type of work, what does that leave me with? And also, what does that mean I could do that would add even more value to the business? Because it's all about adding value. I've had, because I mentioned earlier, have worked in these very large roles. And a lot of what I was doing was also organizational design. So a lot of this is thinking through what is the brand of a safety team? What is the value that a safety team is giving to organizations? And, once you start taking away the paperwork and the bureaucracy, you have to have something better and different that is adding value to a business rather than that.
You mentioned before that you had a great boss in that particular anecdote and story that you told. I'd like to explore the subject of mentorship. How do you see mentorship playing a role in developing future EHS leaders? And what can current leaders do to really foster that growth?
Yeah, I think mentorship is probably a very fundamental thing that all of us both need, in terms of giving and also receiving. What I have found even more powerful in terms of career, though, is actually sponsorship. And sponsorship, I don't know the exact definition of it, but sponsorship is about having someone who knows you, knows your potential, knows what you've also achieved, and is there advocating for you in the room when you're not there. And so, I've considered myself fortunate in terms of having some sponsors that perhaps I didn't know about during my career until someone shared it with me later on to say, do you know that person was your sponsor? I'm like, I don't know what you're even talking about. It was all about me, wasn't it? And they're like, yeah, no, not quite. But, that type of person is the one actually who can build others up and help them with their career. And we often think about sponsors as perhaps being, those more senior people, whether it's an ops person or someone in HR or legal, whatever. But I do also think that as EHS professionals and risk professionals, that we can also help others through that sponsorship, because mentorship is about, helping someone lay out perhaps what skills and experiences they need to work on so that they can find a path forward in their career. But it doesn't always result in what the person is intending or what they want. I was having a conversation the other day actually with someone who's quite early in their career, and they were focusing on how they had the CSP, Certified Safety Professional, and they were going for their CIH exam in November. And for them, technical competence was really important, and they had some mentors. And I said, that's great, but after a while that just becomes table stakes. So what you really need to focus on are other things, whether it's, can you take on a project to show that you can do something else? Can you take a risk and do something that's not easy, but perhaps you can learn from it, in either a positive or in a experiential and learning way. And this is the role I think that mentors can help folks with, but they also need to challenge people, and not only just say, go to this conference, go and do this course, speak to this person. I think it's about thinking about what impact have you made and how can you storytell about the difference that you've made as an EHS professional.
Great answer. Thank you for that insights. Well, and we're getting close to nearing the end. I'd like to jump into our Q&A. So thank you so much already for sharing your valuable insights so far. We hope everyone's found this discussion incredibly enlightening, and you're leaving with some new strategies to enhance health and safety. So there's been a few questions that have come through on the Q&A. So we'll take the next sort of 5 minutes to have a look at those. If that's okay, Megan, we'll see if we can keep the answers relatively short so we can get through a few of them. First sort of question from Miss Anonymous. What can you do when operational leaders talk the talk but don't walk the walk?
Oh, that's such a good one.
It is. You could go for hours on this one. Is there one key thing you can maybe give across?
I think the one key thing is trying to understand who they are as a person and find the lever that you can pull to help make a difference for them. So there'll be plenty, everyone is different, right? Someone wants to focus on the budget, someone else might be worried about compliance. There's so many different things, but understand who the person is, the leader is, and then pull the lever that will work for them.
Oh, yeah, makes complete sense. How do you set up for the transition between moving from lagging indicators that investors and executive team have always traditionally used to identify success within their business to the space where leading indicators can take more precedence in driving the safety culture from the executive team down? Like, how do you manage or set up for that transition?
I think it's important to understand where your business is in a point in time. And I always keep coming back to this thing about business context. A business may still feel comfortable in using lagging indicators. It doesn't mean they're wrong, because also when you're looking at certain sustainability reports or other criteria, that's what the street, it's what certain people understand and they feel comfortable with. So perhaps the answer is don't try and necessarily dismantle those other metrics or measures too quickly, because at least people understand them and you're able to get buy-in through their understanding of them. At the same time, as you're pushing up these new ways of thinking about safety and of measuring it, there's a storytelling or conversation that needs to happen to show them why those are important and what they actually mean. And so, Craig, maybe this goes back to our discussion earlier about having more data helps you to be able to show that, yes, we might have had metrics 1, 2, and 3 before, still good, no worries about those, but actually A, B, and C are related to them in this way. And this is if we measure A, B, and C, then that's the way that we can get better results. So I think you need some good evidence and data behind it, but also don't worry if they're not willing to change it right away. It's not probably as important as you think it is.
Cool. Question from Joven. What are your thoughts on on safety climate survey as a measure? Any recommendations on tools we can use?
I've actually used them in quite a few companies and different styles of them as well. I don't have any specific ones to recommend, so that's answer to your second question. But for the first question, the one that I liked the most actually was in a company that I worked with and we built our own. And I tell you the real value of it. We were able to link different elements of business operations with safety performance. And then what we were able to do was to be able to predict what might happen. I shouldn't say, because nothing is ever 100% right. But you'd be able to reasonably predict what might happen and then actually take actions to change operations to try and mitigate the risk. So I guess I'm very pragmatic. I think using climate surveys just to show that people care about safety, I don't know that depends where your business is. That might be important at a point in time. As you get more mature with the process and with the safety culture, you realize that there are other things that you might want to measure instead.
Nice. This might be a personal question from Aaron. How do you manage improving safety and outcomes and engagement while employees are suffering from change fatigue through constant restructure?
Yeah. I think these days change is absolutely inevitable. And, I'm pausing for a minute because actually what I want to say, and I'm going to say what I want to say, is I actually think that we need to help people understand how to move through change faster and also in a way that they don't feel negatively impacted by it, because it is continual and it's not going to stop. And when people feel like, they can't cope with the amount of change that's happening, there are some industries and organizations where they do cope with it because they understand that it's just the nature of the beast. This is what happens. So I do wonder whether there's actually work that we can do more to help people understand change and move through it faster. And then whether it's safety, whether it's HR, whether it's operations, technology, all of these different groups are all impacted by an employee's ability to absorb and accept change. So I don't think, basically what I'm saying is I don't think we're alone. And
Yeah.
maybe it's easy to feel like we're alone, but I think every function probably feels the same way.
Nice. Well, I'm going to wrap up the Q&As there. There are a few questions that we haven't got to, so feel free to reach out directly to Megan. I'm sure she'll be happy to take a message on LinkedIn or an email if you'd like to get in touch with her directly. Well, that looks like a wrap. Thank you again, Megan, for an amazing conversation and everyone that's joined us today for this chat. It's been an inspiring and really thought-provoking hour or so. So I really, from the other side of the world, I really thank you for your time and hope you've had an enjoyable hour. Thank you for listening to safetyCast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues, because safety knowledge is meant to be shared. Stay safe, stay engaged, and be sure to catch our next episode for more expert insights. See you then.